Daniel had always loved the forest. Every Saturday morning, he would lace up his hiking boots, grab his backpack, and head out to the trails near Pine Ridge. It was his escape, his therapy, his way of clearing his head after a long week of work. As a carpenter, he spent most days bent over workbenches, breathing in sawdust and meeting deadlines. But out here, surrounded by towering pines and the smell of earth after rain, he felt alive. This particular morning in late October was no different. The air was crisp, filled with that perfect autumn chill that made you grateful for a warm jacket. Fog hung low between the trees, giving everything a mysterious, almost magical quality. Daniel had been walking for about an hour, following a trail he knew by heart, when he heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks. It was a sound that didn't belong in the forest. A soft whimpering, almost like a wounded animal, but not quite. His heart started beating faster. He stood perfectly still, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. There it was again, coming from somewhere off the trail to his left, beyond a cluster of fallen logs covered in moss. Daniel stepped carefully off the path, pushing aside low-hanging branches and stepping over roots that jutted up from the ground. The whimpering grew louder. His mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was a hurt dog. Maybe someone else had gotten injured on the trail. Whatever it was, someone or something needed help. When he finally reached the fallen logs and looked behind them, his breath caught in his throat. Curled up in a small ball, shivering and covered in mud, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Her pink jacket was torn at the sleeve, her shoes were caked with dirt, and tear tracks ran down her dirty cheeks. Her eyes, wide with fear, locked onto his. For a moment, Daniel just stood there trying to process what he was seeing. A child, alone, in the middle of the forest, miles from the nearest road. How was this even possible? He immediately crouched down, making himself smaller, less threatening. He knew from raising his own son that scared kids needed gentle approaches. "Hey there," he said softly, keeping his voice calm and warm. "My name is Daniel. You're safe now, okay? Can you tell me your name?" The little girl hiccuped, wiping her nose with the back of her muddy hand. "Sophie," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Sophie. That's a beautiful name," Daniel said, slowly reaching into his backpack. He pulled out his fleece jacket, the one he'd packed just in case the temperature dropped. "You must be freezing. Here, let me put this around you." Sophie didn't resist as he gently wrapped the jacket around her small shoulders. She was trembling, and not just from the cold. The poor kid was terrified. Daniel's father instincts kicked into high gear. His own son, Tyler, was 8 now, but he remembered those early years. The scraped knees and nightmares. The way kids needed you to be strong and steady when their world felt scary. "Sophie, can you tell me how you got here? Where are your parents?" Daniel asked, sitting down on one of the logs to be at her eye level. "I was playing," Sophie said between sniffles, "at the big house. There were so many rooms. I wanted to explore outside. I saw the trees and they looked pretty, so I walked and walked. Then I couldn't find my way back. I called for Miss Jenny, but nobody came." Daniel's mind was racing. A big house. That could mean the Henderson estate about 3 miles north, or maybe the newer development being built on the east side. But 3 miles was a long way for little legs. "This child must have been walking for hours. Are you hurt anywhere? Does anything feel sore?" he asked, checking her over carefully. Besides being cold, dirty, and scared, she seemed physically okay. No visible injuries, no blood. That was something to be grateful for. "I'm hungry," Sophie said quietly, and Daniel's heart broke a little. "I've got just the thing," he said, reaching back into his pack. He pulled out a granola bar and a water bottle. "It's not fancy, but it'll help. Take small bites, okay?" Sophie grabbed the granola bar like it was the best thing she'd ever seen. As she ate, Daniel pulled out his phone. No signal, of course not. They were too deep in the forest, surrounded by hills that blocked reception. He knew from experience that he'd need to get at least a mile closer to the trailhead before his phone would work. "All right, Sophie," he said, making his voice cheerful. "Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to carry you out of here and we're going to find your parents. They must be very worried about you. Would that be okay?" Sophie nodded, finishing the last bite of her granola bar. Daniel stood up and carefully lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than Tyler, all tiny bones and fragile hope. She immediately wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder. He could feel her whole body relaxing slightly, as if she finally believed that maybe, just maybe, Things would be okay. Daniel started walking back toward the trail, moving as quickly as he could while being careful not to trip. His mind was already making plans. Get to a spot with phone signal, call 911, get search and rescue involved. This kid's parents were probably losing their minds right now. He knew he would be if Tyler went missing. They'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when Daniel heard something that made him pause. It was a distant sound, rhythmic and mechanical, growing louder. He looked up through the gaps in the trees and spotted it. A helicopter flying low, clearly searching for something. Or someone. Sophie, do you hear that? Daniel asked. That helicopter might be looking for you. The little girl lifted her head, listening. Her eyes widened. That's like the one my mommy has, she said. Before Daniel could process what that meant, her mommy has a helicopter? The sound grew deafening. The helicopter was descending, finding a clearing maybe 100 yards away. Daniel adjusted his grip on Sophie and started moving toward it, his boots crunching on fallen leaves. They emerged from the tree line into a natural clearing, just as the helicopter touched down. The wash from the rotors sent leaves and dust swirling everywhere. Daniel raised one arm to shield Sophie's face while keeping a firm hold on her with the other. The helicopter door slid open, and Daniel got his first look at Sophie's mother. She was not what he expected. The woman who jumped out before the helicopter had even fully settled was dressed in an expensive-looking suit, the kind you saw in business magazines. Her dark hair was pulled back perfectly, and even from a distance there was something commanding about her presence. But all of that disappeared the moment she saw Sophie. The woman ran toward them, her designer shoes completely impractical for the forest floor, but she didn't seem to care. Her face was a mixture of relief so intense it was almost painful to watch, and anguish that came from every parent's worst nightmare nearly coming true. Sophie, she cried out, her voice cracking. Sophie, baby! Behind her, more people were emerging. Men in dark suits with earpieces, people in search and rescue gear, a small army of people who had clearly been looking for one little girl. Daniel gently set Sophie down, and the moment her feet touched the ground, she was running. Mommy, she called out, and then she was in her mother's arms. The woman dropped to her knees right there in the dirt, not caring about her expensive clothes. She was checking Sophie all over, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face. She was whispering things Daniel couldn't hear, but he didn't need to. He knew that feeling, that overwhelming flood of relief when your child is safe. Daniel stood there awkwardly, suddenly feeling like an outsider in an intimate moment. He should probably just slip away. But one of the men in suits was already approaching him, and Sophie's mother was looking up, her eyes finding his. That's when Daniel realized that his ordinary Saturday morning hike had just collided with a world he'd only ever seen on television. And somehow he had a feeling this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The woman stayed on her knees for what felt like forever, holding Sophie like she might disappear if she let go. Daniel watched as she examined every inch of her daughter, checking for cuts, bruises, anything that might be wrong. Her perfectly manicured fingers were now streaked with dirt, but she didn't seem to notice or care. Are you hurt? Does anything hurt, baby? Tell Mommy everything, she was saying, her voice thick with emotion. Sophie was shaking her head, saying she was okay, that the nice man had given her his jacket and a granola bar. That's when the woman looked up at Daniel again, really looked at him. Her eyes were still wet with tears, but there was something else there now. Gratitude so deep it seemed to radiate from her. She stood up slowly, still holding Sophie against her hip, and walked over to him. Up close, Daniel could see she was probably in her late 30s, with the kind of composure that came from running boardrooms and making million-dollar decisions. But right now that composure was cracked wide open, showing the terrified mother underneath. You found her, she said, her voice barely steady. You found my daughter. Daniel shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the intensity of her gaze. I just happened to be hiking. Anyone would have done the same thing, but it wasn't anyone. It was you. She adjusted Sophie on her hip. I'm Victoria. Victoria Chen. The name hit Daniel like a slap. Victoria Chen. Even he, who barely followed business news, knew that name. Chen Technologies, the self-made billionaire who'd built a tech empire from nothing. He'd seen her face on the cover of magazines at the grocery store checkout line, and now she was standing in front of him in the forest covered in dirt, thanking him for finding her daughter. Daniel Rivera, he managed to say, feeling completely out of his depth. Behind Victoria, the search team was securing the perimeter, talking into radios, doing whatever it was that professional rescue teams did. One of the suited men was approaching, clearly security, and his expression said he didn't like that his boss was talking to a stranger. "Ms. Chen, we should get Sophie checked out by the medical team," the security man said, his tone respectful but firm. Victoria nodded but didn't take her eyes off Daniel. "How far did she wander?" "About 2 miles from where I found her," Daniel said. "She mentioned a big house. I was going to carry her to somewhere with phone signal and call for help. But then I heard your helicopter." Victoria closed her eyes for a moment, as if the thought of Sophie being that far away was physically painful. 2 miles. Oh God, she must have been walking for hours. She looked down at Sophie, brushing mud-caked hair from her daughter's forehead. "Baby, you must have been so scared." Sophie nodded against her mother's neck. "But then Daniel found me. He's nice, Mommy, like the nice people in stories." Something passed across Victoria's face, an emotion Daniel couldn't quite read. She pulled a card from somewhere in her suit jacket and handed it to him. "Please, I need to thank you properly. This is my personal assistant's number. Call tomorrow, or the next day. Whenever you can, please." Daniel took the card more out of politeness than anything. What was he supposed to say? He hadn't done anything special. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just glad she's safe." "I insist," Victoria said, and there was steel under the gratitude now. This was a woman used to getting what she wanted. "You saved my daughter's life. That's not something I take lightly." Before Daniel could protest again, one of the medical team members approached with a blanket and a medical bag. The security detail was subtly but firmly moving to escort Victoria and Sophie toward the helicopter. Daniel found himself stepping back, watching as they whisked Sophie away toward the aircraft. Victoria looked back once, her eyes meeting his across the clearing, and then they were gone. The helicopter lifted off with that same deafening roar, sending leaves and dust swirling again. Daniel stood there long after it disappeared into the sky, the business card still in his hand. Around him, the search and rescue team was packing up, radios crackling with confirmation that the child had been found safe. A few of them nodded at him, or gave him a thumbs up as they headed back to their vehicles on the access road nearby. Then they were gone too, and Daniel was alone in the forest again. Alone with the silence and the sound of his own thoughts. He looked down at the card. Thick, expensive cardstock, embossed lettering, an email address and phone number, nothing else. It felt surreal, holding this piece of Victoria Chen's world in his work-roughened hands. Daniel pocketed the card and started the walk back to his truck, his mind racing. 2 hours ago, he'd been thinking about whether he should refinish the Hendersons' kitchen cabinets or start on the Matsuda's deck project. Now he'd pulled a billionaire's daughter out of the forest and had her personal contact information in his pocket. When he got home that afternoon, his son Tyler was sprawled on the couch playing video games, exactly where Daniel had left him. The house was small, just a rental, but it was home. The furniture was mismatched, mostly second-hand stuff, but it was clean and comfortable. This was their world, his and Tyler's, simple, predictable, safe. "How was the hike, Dad?" Tyler asked without looking away from his game. "Interesting," Daniel said, which was possibly the understatement of the year. He decided not to mention the whole thing. Tyler didn't need to know his dad had stumbled into something this weird. Besides, it was over now. He'd probably never hear from Victoria Chen again. Rich people lived in a different universe. They didn't actually follow up on things like this. But he was wrong. 3 days later, Daniel's phone rang while he was in the middle of sanding down a bookshelf in his workshop. The number was unfamiliar and he almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Is this Daniel Rivera?" a crisp, professional voice asked. "Speaking." "My name is Helen Zhao. I'm Ms. Victoria Chen's personal assistant. She asked me to reach out to you to arrange a meeting. Would you have time this week?" Daniel nearly dropped his phone. "A meeting? For what?" "Ms. Chen would like to thank you in person for what you did for her daughter. She's extremely grateful and would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you." Part of Daniel wanted to say no. What did he have to talk about with a billionaire? But another part of him, the part that had been raised to be polite and respectful, couldn't refuse. And maybe if he was honest with himself, he was curious. "I guess I could do that," he said slowly. "Wonderful. Would Thursday at 10 o'clock work for you? There's a cafe called Riverside Commons in town. Ms. Chen thought a public, casual location might be more comfortable. They set the details, and when Daniel hung up, he just stood there in his workshop, surrounded by sawdust and half-finished projects, wondering what he'd just agreed to. Thursday morning came too fast. Daniel changed his shirt 3 times, which was ridiculous. It was just a thank you meeting. Why was he nervous? He finally settled on a clean flannel shirt and jeans, the same thing he wore to parent-teacher conferences. It would have to do. Riverside Commons was one of those upscale cafes that had shown up in town a few years ago, all exposed brick and artisanal coffee. Daniel had never been inside. A cup of coffee cost what he usually spent on lunch for the week. But Victoria had chosen it, probably because it was nice enough to meet her standards but public enough not to seem weird. He spotted her immediately. She was sitting at a corner table and even in casual clothes, well, casual for her, which meant designer jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than his truck, she stood out. There was security too, Daniel noticed. 2 men trying to look inconspicuous at a nearby table. You couldn't be one of the richest women in the country without protection, he supposed. Victoria saw him and stood up, a genuine smile crossing her face. Daniel, thank you so much for coming. They sat down and an awkward silence settled over them. What did a billionaire tech CEO and a carpenter even talk about? Victoria broke it first. How is your coffee? I haven't ordered yet, Daniel admitted. She laughed, and it was a real laugh, not the polite kind. I'm sorry. I'm not usually this nervous. I do board meetings with investors who could crush my company, but this feels harder somehow. That made Daniel relax a little. I'm nervous too. I've never met someone famous before. Unless you count the guy who played the villain in that superhero movie who came through town once. Victoria smiled. I'm not famous. I'm just someone who works too much and got lucky with timing. She paused, her expression turning serious. Daniel, I asked you here because I want to thank you properly. What you did for Sophie, I don't think you understand what that meant. I just found her, made sure she was safe until you got there. You did more than that. You made her feel safe. She hasn't stopped talking about you. The kind man in the forest who gave her his jacket and shared his food. Who carried her and told her everything would be okay. Victoria's voice caught slightly. She's been through a lot. Her father, my ex-husband, died 2 years ago. Car accident. Since then, Sophie has been struggling. Anxiety, nightmares. She doesn't trust easily anymore. But she trusted you immediately. Daniel didn't know what to say to that. He thought about Tyler. About how he'd feel if something happened to his son. I'm sorry about her father. That's rough. For both of you. Thank you. Victoria took a sip of her coffee. Can I ask you something personal? The background check mentioned you're a single father too. Background check. Right, of course she'd done a background check. Daniel should probably be offended, but honestly, if Tyler went missing and a stranger found him, Daniel would want to know everything about that person too. Yeah, my wife. She died giving birth to Tyler. Complications, it was just me and him from day one. I'm so sorry. It was 8 years ago. We're okay now. It's just different than what I thought life would be. Victoria nodded slowly, like she understood that feeling more than he might expect. Then she took a breath like she was about to jump off a cliff. Daniel, I have a proposal for you, and I need you to hear me out before you say no. Daniel's stomach tightened. When billionaires said they had proposals, it usually meant something complicated. He set down his coffee cup and nodded. Okay, I'm listening. Victoria leaned forward slightly. Sophie needs someone in her life who isn't staff, who isn't paid to smile at her or follow protocols. She needs someone real, someone who sees her as a child, not as the daughter of Victoria Chen. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Since she came home, all she talks about is you. She asks when you're coming to visit. She wants to show you her room, her toys, everything. And I realized something. You gave her something in 20 minutes that I've been trying to give her for 2 years. You made her feel safe. Miss Chen, I appreciate what you're saying, but Victoria. Please just call me Victoria. She took a breath. I want to hire you. Not as security, not as a nanny. As Sophie's companion. Someone who can spend time with her, teach her things, help her feel like a normal kid. Someone who can be there in ways I can't always be because I'm running a company. Daniel stared at her. You want to hire me to, what? Hang out with your daughter? I know how it sounds, but yes. 3 days a week at first, maybe more if it works out. You'd come to the estate, spend time with Sophie, do activities with her. Teach her carpentry if you want. Take her hiking. Help her with homework. Just be a stable, kind presence in her life. Victoria pulled out a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. This is what I'm offering. Daniel opened the folder. His eyes went straight to the number at the bottom of the page and his brain temporarily stopped working. That salary was more than he made in 3 years of carpentry work. This can't be right. It's right. That's annually, with benefits included. Health insurance, dental, vision, for both you and your son. This is insane. Nobody pays this much for what matters most. For my daughter's well-being? Victoria's voice was quiet but intense. I've paid consultants more than that to tell me how to optimize my supply chain. I've spent more on marketing campaigns that failed. This isn't insane. This is me finally understanding what's actually important. Daniel sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. With this kind of money, he could move Tyler out of their rental. He could buy a house. Pay for Tyler's college in advance. Stop worrying about whether his truck would make it another year. Fix the leaky roof. Replace the ancient water heater. Maybe even save some money for the first time in his life. But it felt wrong. Why me? You could hire professional child psychologists, therapists, educators. I have those. Sophie has a therapist she sees twice a week. She has tutors for her studies. She has music teachers and art instructors. Victoria's voice softened. What she doesn't have is someone who just treats her like a regular kid. Someone who doesn't handle her with kid gloves because her mother is rich. You did that naturally without thinking about it. That's what she needs. Daniel rubbed his face with his hands. This was too much, too fast. Too everything. I need to think about this. Of course. Take all the time you need. Victoria started to gather her things, then paused. Can I share something with you? Something I haven't told anyone outside my therapist. Daniel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The day Sophie went missing, I was on a conference call. A call I deemed important about some acquisition in Singapore. My assistant nanny, Jenny, was watching Sophie. But Jenny got distracted by a delivery at the door and Sophie wandered off. By the time anyone noticed, she'd been gone for over an hour. Victoria's hands trembled slightly. For those 3 hours before we found her, I kept thinking about how the last thing I'd said to Sophie that morning was, "Mommy's busy. Go play." Not "I love you." Not "you're the most important thing in my life." Just "Mommy's busy." The pain in her voice was raw and real. Daniel knew that feeling, the guilt that came with single parenting, with never having enough time, with always feeling like you were failing somehow. I built this company from nothing, Victoria continued. I worked 90-hour weeks. I sacrificed everything to prove I could succeed. And I did succeed. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of why I was doing it. I wanted to give Sophie a good life, security, opportunities. But what good are opportunities if she's too anxious to take them? What good is security if she doesn't feel safe in her own home? She looked directly at Daniel and he saw something he recognized. A parent who was trying their best and feeling like it wasn't enough. I'm not asking you to replace her father.
I'm not asking you to be anything other than who you are.
I'm just asking you to give my daughter what you gave her in that forest. Kindness. Patience. Someone who makes her feel like she matters. Not because of who her mother is, but just because she's Sophie. Daniel drove home in a daze. The folder sat on his passenger seat like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He kept glancing at it, making sure it was real and not something he'd imagined. When he got home, Tyler was doing homework at the kitchen table, his tongue sticking out slightly in concentration the way it always did when he was focused. Daniel watched him for a moment. This kid who'd made his life complete and complicated and beautiful all at once. Hey, Dad. How'd your meeting go? It was interesting. Daniel sat down across from him. Tyler, what would you say if I told you I might be changing jobs? Tyler looked up concerned. Are you okay? Did something happen with your carpentry business? No, nothing like that. Someone offered me a different kind of job. It would mean more money. A lot more money. But it would also mean big changes. What kind of job? Daniel tried to figure out how to explain it in a way that wouldn't sound completely bizarre. Do you remember a few days ago I went hiking? I didn't tell you this, but I found a little girl who was lost in the forest. Her mom is really grateful, and she wants to hire me to spend time with her daughter. Like a mentor, I guess. Someone to do activities with her and help her feel safe. Tyler processed this. Is she rich? Very rich, like buy a private island rich? More like owns several companies rich, Tyler whistled. And she wants you to just hang out with her kid? That's weird, I know it sounds weird. But the little girl, Sophie, she's been through some hard times. Her dad died. She's scared a lot. And apparently I helped her feel safe when I found her. And her mom thinks I could help her feel safe more often. Tyler was quiet for a moment, then asked the question Daniel had been asking himself. Do you want to do it, did he? Daniel thought about Sophie's face when he'd found her so scared and alone. He thought about how she'd relaxed in his arms, trusting him completely. He thought about Victoria's voice when she talked about feeling like she was failing her daughter. I think maybe I do, Daniel admitted. But it would mean being away from home more. Going to their estate several times a week. You'd be alone more after school. Dad, I'm 8, not 5. I can handle being alone for a few hours. Mrs. Peterson next door always says I can come over if I need anything. Tyler grinned. Plus, if you're making really good money, maybe we could finally get a new Xbox instead of that ancient one that sounds like it's going to explode. Despite everything, Daniel laughed. Trust Tyler to cut through complexity with 8-year-old logic. That night, after Tyler had gone to bed, Daniel sat at his small kitchen table with the folder open in front of him. He read through every page. The salary, the benefits, the schedule expectations. Victoria had even included a clause that Tyler could visit the estate on weekends, use the pool and recreational facilities, even join in on Sophie's educational sessions if he wanted. She'd thought of everything. More than that, she'd thought about what would make this work for his family, not just hers. Daniel pulled out his phone and stared at the number for Helen, Victoria's assistant. It was late, but he'd been told he could call any time. He took a deep breath and dialed before he could change his mind. Helen answered on the second ring. Daniel, I'm glad you called. I've thought about it, Daniel said. I want to do it. I'll take the job. He could hear the smile in Helen's voice. That's wonderful. Miss Chen will be so pleased. Can you start Monday? Monday works. After he hung up, Daniel sat in the quiet of his kitchen for a long time. He'd just agreed to step into a world he knew nothing about. A world of wealth and privilege and expectations he couldn't even imagine. But he'd also agreed to help a little girl who needed someone to make her feel safe. He thought about his own childhood, growing up without much money, but with a father who'd always made time for him. His dad had been a construction worker, coming home tired and sore every day, but never too tired to throw a baseball or help with homework. That's what he'd tried to be for Sophie. Not someone fancy or impressive, just someone steady and kind. Monday morning came faster than Daniel expected. He'd barely slept, his mind running through 1,000 scenarios of how this could go wrong. What if Sophie didn't actually like him once the initial excitement wore off? What if he didn't fit in at a billionaire's estate? What if the other staff treated him like an outsider? The estate was a 40-minute drive from his place. As he pulled up to the gates, his truck looking incredibly out of place among the sleek black SUVs and luxury cars, a security guard checked his ID and waved him through. The main house was massive, all modern architecture and glass walls with a view of the forest behind it. Daniel parked in the guest lot, feeling more nervous than he'd felt in years. Victoria met him at the door herself, which surprised him. She was dressed casually, or what passed for casual in her world, designer jeans and a crisp white shirt. Daniel, welcome. Come in. The inside of the house was even more intimidating than the outside. Everything was pristine, decorated with what Daniel assumed was expensive art, though he wouldn't know expensive art from a poster at Walmart. But before he could feel too overwhelmed, he heard footsteps pounding down a hallway, and Sophie appeared, her face lit up like Christmas morning. Daniel, you came. Mommy said you were coming, but I didn't know if it was real. Oh. She ran straight to him, and without thinking, Daniel crouched down and caught her in a hug. Over her head, he saw Victoria's expression, and there were tears in her eyes. I told you I'd come, Daniel said to Sophie. Want to show me around? Sophie grabbed his hand and started pulling him toward a hallway. I want to show you everything. My room and my playroom and the garden and the pool and... Victoria laughed. Maybe give him a chance to breathe first, Sophie. But Daniel just smiled and let Sophie pull him along. This was why he was here. Not for the money or the fancy house or any of that. He was here because this little girl needed someone to care, and somehow, he'd become that someone. As they walked through the enormous house, Sophie chattering excitedly about everything they passed. Daniel realized something. He'd spent years in his small world, making enough to get by, focused on just him and Tyler. It had been safe, predictable, but maybe safe and predictable wasn't always enough. Maybe sometimes you had to step into something unknown because someone needed you, and maybe, just maybe, you needed it too. The first few weeks were harder than Daniel expected, not because of Sophie, who lit up every time he arrived, but because of everything else. The estate staff moved around him like he was invisible, polite but distant. They had their routines, their hierarchies, and he was something new they didn't know how to categorize. Was he staff? Was he something else? Nobody seemed sure, including Daniel himself. The head of household, a stern woman named Patricia, made it clear she didn't understand his role. "We have educational specialists for Sophie's learning needs," she'd said that first week, her tone implying Daniel was redundant at best, suspicious at worst. "We have child psychologists and therapists. What exactly is it you'll be providing?" Daniel hadn't had a good answer then. He still wasn't sure he had one now, 3 weeks in, but when he was with Sophie, it didn't matter. They'd spend hours in the estate's massive backyard, which backed onto the same forest where he'd found her. At first, Sophie had been scared to go near the trees, but slowly, with Daniel beside her, she'd gotten braver. "See that bird?" Daniel would point out. "That's a chickadee. You can tell by the black cap on its head and how it says its own name. Chickadee-dee-dee." Sophie would listen intently, then try to imitate the call herself. She was curious about everything once you got past her shyness. Why did leaves change color? How did birds know how to build nests? Could you eat the berries on that bush? Daniel didn't always know the answers, but he'd help her look them up, turning every question into a small adventure. He'd also set up a small workshop in one of the estate's unused storage buildings, with Victoria's permission. Nothing fancy, just some basic tools and scrap wood. He'd started teaching Sophie simple carpentry, how to measure, how to hammer a nail without smashing your thumb, how to sand something smooth. She wasn't particularly good at it, but she loved it anyway, loved the feeling of making something with her own hands. "Look, Daniel," she'd exclaim, holding up a crooked birdhouse they'd built together. "We made this. Can we put it up in the garden?" "Absolutely. The birds will love it." It was during these moments that Daniel would sometimes look up and see Victoria watching from a window. She never interrupted, just observed, and there was always this expression on her face that Daniel couldn't quite read, longing maybe, or regret, like she was seeing something she wished she could be part of but didn't know how. A month in, Victoria started joining them for dinner. At first it was awkward. They'd eat in the formal dining room with staff serving courses, and Daniel would sit there wondering which fork to use and whether he was chewing too loudly. But Sophie would chatter on about her day, and slowly the conversation would become more natural. "Daniel taught me about photosynthesis today," Sophie announced one evening. "Plants are like tiny food factories." Victoria smiled at her daughter, then looked at Daniel. "You're good with her. Better than I hoped. She's easy to teach, curious about everything. She gets that from her father." Victoria's voice softened. "Robert was like that. He could get excited about the smallest things. A weird cloud formation, the way light hit a building. I used to tease him about it." It was the first time she'd really talked about her late husband. Sophie had gone quiet, and Daniel noticed her hand creep across the table toward her mother's. Victoria caught it and held tight. "You miss Daddy," Sophie said. "It wasn't a question. Every day, baby. Every single day. Me too." Sophie looked at Daniel. "But it's okay to be happy sometimes too, right? Even though we miss him?" Daniel felt the weight of the question. This wasn't about carpentry or bird calls. This was real. "Your dad would want you to be happy," he said carefully. "Missing someone and being happy aren't opposites. You can do both." Victoria's eyes met his across the table, and something passed between them. Understanding, maybe. Recognition of shared pain. They were both trying to raise kids alone, both carrying the weight of loss, both doing their best and never quite sure if it was enough. Tyler started coming on weekends, which changed everything. At first, Daniel worried about how the two kids would get along. Tyler was 8, Sophie only 5. Tyler was boisterous and energetic, Sophie still cautious and quiet. But kids had a way of figuring things out. The first Saturday Tyler visited, he'd taken one look at the estate's game room, pool, and massive backyard and declared it the coolest place ever. Sophie had been shy at first, hiding behind Daniel, but Tyler had just grinned at her. "Want to see how high I can jump off the diving board?" he'd asked. Sophie had nodded, and just like that, they were friends. Tyler became the fun older brother figure Sophie had never had, teaching her games, making her laugh, including her in everything. And Sophie brought out a gentler side of Tyler, made him more patient and protective. Daniel would watch them playing together and feel something shift in his chest. This strange arrangement was becoming something real. Something like family, even though none of them were related. Victoria noticed it too. She'd started spending more time at home, working from her estate office instead of going downtown every day. She'd appear during lunch or take breaks to watch the kids play. Sometimes she'd sit with Daniel on the patio while the kids swam, and they'd just talk. "I don't remember the last time I heard Sophie laugh like that," Victoria said one afternoon. "Watching Sophie and Tyler have a splash fight in the pool. Tyler's good for her. Brings her out of her shell. You're good for her too." Victoria turned to look at him. "I want you to know that. What you've done for Sophie in just a month, it's remarkable. She's sleeping better, having fewer nightmares. Her therapist says she's making real progress." Daniel felt embarrassed by the praise. "I'm just spending time with her. It's not complicated, but it is. It's the most complicated thing in the world, actually. Being present. Really seeing someone. Most people can't do it, especially not with other people's kids." Victoria paused. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Sure. Do you ever get lonely? Raising Tyler by yourself?" The question caught him off guard. "Sometimes. Late at night when he's asleep and the house is too quiet. Or when he has a school thing and all the other parents show up in couples." Daniel looked at his hands. "But mostly I'm too busy to think about it. And Tyler's enough. He's always been enough." "But that's not the same as having someone," Victoria said quietly. "I know. I tell myself Sophie is enough too, and she is. She's everything. But there's still this space where another adult should be. Someone to share the decisions with. Someone to talk to after the kids are in bed." They sat in comfortable silence watching the kids play. Daniel was acutely aware of Victoria beside him, the way the sun caught her hair, how she'd started dressing more casually around the house, how she laughed more easily than she had at first. He was also aware that these thoughts were dangerous. She was his employer. She was a billionaire. He was just the carpenter she'd hired to help her daughter. Nothing more. But then Victoria would look at him a certain way, or their hands would accidentally touch while reaching for something, and Daniel would wonder if he was imagining the spark that seemed to pass between them. He told himself he was imagining it. He had to be. One evening in early December, a storm knocked out power across the entire region. The estate's backup generators kicked in for essential systems, but most of the house was dark. Patricia lit candles and built a fire in the main living room fireplace. The staff who lived off property had gone home early, and it was just Victoria, Daniel, Sophie, and Tyler in the enormous house. They made it an adventure. They roasted marshmallows in the fireplace, told ghost stories that weren't too scary, played board games by candlelight. Sophie and Tyler eventually fell asleep on the couch, curled up under blankets like puppies. Victoria and Daniel stayed up, keeping the fire going, not wanting to break the spell of the evening. They had moved from wine to coffee, talking in low voices so as not to wake the kids. "I never did this," Victoria said, staring into the fire. "When I was building the company, I worked through every power outage, every holiday, every moment I should have been living my life. I told myself it was for Sophie's future, for her security." She laughed softly, but there wasn't much humor in it. "But what good is security if you miss all the moments that matter?" "You're here now, Dania," offered, "because you showed me how to be. You and your simple kindness and your bird calls and your terrible carpentry jokes." She looked at him, and in the firelight, her eyes were bright. "Daniel, I need to tell you something." His heart started beating faster. "Okay, I think I'm falling for you." The words came out in a rush, like she'd been holding them back for weeks. "I know I shouldn't. I know it's complicated and probably inappropriate, and there's 1,000 reasons why it's a bad idea. But I can't stop thinking about you. Can't stop noticing the way you are with Sophie, with Tyler, with me. You've made me feel things I haven't felt since Robert died. Things I didn't think I'd ever feel again." Daniel sat frozen, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. 1,000 thoughts crashed through his mind at once. She felt it too. This wasn't just him imagining things. She was falling for him the way he was falling for her, despite every logical reason not to. "Victoria," he started, then stopped. What was he supposed to say? That he felt the same way? That he'd been fighting these feelings for weeks? That every time she smiled at him, something in his chest tightened? "You don't have to say anything," Victoria said quickly. "I shouldn't have put you in this position. You work for me. There's a power imbalance. I'm your employer, and I just made everything weird and uncomfortable, and—" Daniel set down his coffee cup and reached over, taking her hand. It was soft compared to his calloused one, but her grip was strong. "You didn't make it weird. I feel it too." Victoria's breath caught. "You do?" "I've been trying not to. Telling myself I'm crazy. You're Victoria Chen. I'm just a guy who works with wood and can barely figure out which fork to use at your dinner table. We're from completely different worlds. I don't care about worlds. I care about this." Victoria gestured between them. "I care about how you make me laugh. How safe I feel when you're around. How you see me as just Victoria, not as some business mogul or public figure. Do you know how rare that is? I see you as the woman who would give up everything for her daughter, who sits and watches us from windows because she wishes she knew how to join in, who's brilliant and driven but also kind and tired and trying so hard all the time." Daniel squeezed her hand. "That's who I see." They were leaning closer now, the space between them charged with something electric. Daniel could smell her perfume, something subtle and expensive. Could see the way the firelight danced in her eyes. His sensible brain was screaming that this was a terrible idea, but his heart didn't care. "We should talk about this when it's not late and we haven't had wine," Victoria whispered, but she wasn't pulling away. "Probably," Daniel agreed, also not pulling away. The kiss happened naturally, inevitably, like it had always been waiting to happen. It was gentle at first, tentative, both of them testing unfamiliar territory. Then Victoria's hand came up to cup his face and Daniel pulled her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "What do we do now?" "I have no idea," Victoria admitted. "But I don't want to pretend this didn't happen." "Me neither." They sat like that for a long time, holding hands, watching the fire burn down to embers, while the kids slept peacefully on the couch. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, something new and fragile and impossibly complicated had just begun. The next few weeks existed in this strange bubble of happiness that Daniel knew couldn't last. He and Victoria were careful around the kids and staff, keeping things professional during the day. But after Sophie went to bed, they'd steal moments together. Conversations that stretched into midnight. Kisses in the garden when no one was watching. Shared glances across the dinner table that made Daniel's heart race. It felt teenage and reckless and wonderful. Daniel felt alive in a way he hadn't since before his wife died. And Victoria seemed transformed too, lighter somehow, quicker to laugh, more present with Sophie. They were building something real, all four of them. A family that didn't look traditional but felt right. Then everything fell apart in the space of a single afternoon. Daniel was in his workshop with Sophie, helping her sand down a jewelry box she was making for her mother's birthday, when Helen appeared in the doorway. Her expression was tight, professional in that way that meant bad news. "Daniel, I need to speak with you privately." Sophie looked up, concerned. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart," Daniel lied. "Why don't you keep working on your box?" "I'll be right back." He followed Helen outside, his stomach sinking with every step. She handed him a tablet showing a celebrity gossip website. The headline made his blood run cold. "Tech billionaire Victoria Chen's secret romance with employee." The photo had been taken through the garden fence, grainy but clear enough. Him and Victoria kissing under the oak tree. The article was full of speculation and barely veiled judgment. Questions about impropriety, power dynamics, whether this affected her ability to lead her company. "How bad is this?" Daniel asked, though he already knew. "The board of directors has called an emergency meeting. They're concerned about the optics." Helen's voice was carefully neutral, but Daniel could hear the worry underneath. "Ms. Chen is meeting with them now." Daniel felt sick. He'd known this was coming in the back of his mind. Had known that their bubble couldn't last forever. But knowing and experiencing it were two different things. What happens now? I don't know. But Daniel? Helen looked at him directly. "For what it's worth, I've worked for Ms. Chen for 7 years. I've never seen her this happy. Not once in all that time. The board meeting stretched for hours. Daniel spent that time in a kind of purgatory, keeping Sophie distracted while his mind raced through worst-case scenarios. Tyler, who'd come over after school, kept asking if something was wrong, and Daniel didn't know how to answer. Finally, as evening was falling, Victoria's assistant called him to the main house. He found Victoria in her office, still in her business suit, looking exhausted and furious and heartbroken all at once. "They gave me an ultimatum," she said without preamble. "End the relationship immediately and let you go, or they'll call for a vote of no confidence." Daniel's chest tightened. A vote of no confidence? Can they do that? They can try. I still hold majority shares, but they can make things difficult. Create chaos. Tank the stock price. Force investigations. Victoria rubbed her temples. 15 years I've spent building this company. 15 years of 90-hour weeks and sacrificed relationships and proving myself over and over. What did you tell them? I told them to go to hell. Victoria laughed, but it was bitter. Then my lawyer pulled me aside and explained exactly how much damage they could do if they wanted to. Not just to me, to the company, to the thousands of people who work for us, to the shareholders who've trusted me with their investments. Daniel sat down heavily. He knew what she was going to say next. Could see it in the set of her shoulders, the resignation in her eyes. I need time to think, Victoria continued, to figure out the best path forward. For everyone. Victoria, I can't lose my company, Daniel. It's not just about ego. It's about responsibility. I have employees who depend on those jobs. Contracts that need to be fulfilled. If I step down in chaos, it affects everyone. Daniel understood. Of course he understood. But that didn't make it hurt less. So what are you saying? I don't know what I'm saying. I just need time. They stood there in her office, the space between them suddenly feeling like a canyon. All the warmth and connection from the past few weeks had been replaced by cold reality. Daniel was an employee who'd overstepped. She was his boss who'd made a mistake. That's how the world would see it, no matter what the truth was. Daniel made his decision before Victoria could make hers. That night, after he'd taken Tyler home and put him to bed, he sat down and wrote a resignation letter. It was short and professional. He thanked Victoria for the opportunity, said he felt it was time to pursue other options, left out everything that mattered. He emailed it to Helen at midnight, then blocked Victoria's number before he could lose his nerve. He didn't want to hear her beg him to stay or try to explain. He didn't want to make this harder than it already was. She had an impossible choice to make, and he could at least take away one of her options, make the decision for her. The next morning, Daniel woke Tyler early. "We're taking a trip," he announced. "Just you and me. Remember Aunt Linda's cabin upstate? I called her last night. We can stay there for a few weeks." Tyler, still groggy, blinked at him. "What about school? What about your work?" "You can do schoolwork remotely for a bit. And I need a break from work. We both need a break. What do you say? Father-son adventure?" Tyler must have seen something in his father's face because he didn't ask more questions. "Okay, Dad, let me pack." They left before lunch, Daniel's truck loaded with clothes and supplies. He left a note for Mrs. Peterson asking her to collect his mail. He didn't tell anyone else where they were going. He just needed to disappear for a while, to give Victoria space to rebuild her life without him complicating everything. The cabin was exactly what he needed. Remote, quiet, no internet, just woods and a lake and time to think. Tyler fished and explored while Daniel tried to work through his feelings. He told himself he'd done the right thing. Victoria needed her calm,